What if I told you that in 1947, a librarian in rural Massachusetts discovered a collection of books that shouldn't exist? Books containing detailed biographies of people who wouldn't be born for another 50 years. Books that predicted deaths, marriages, and tragedies with impossible accuracy. Books that drove their discoverer to madness and eventually to her own mysterious disappearance. This is the story of Eleanor Whitmore and the cursed collection that the academic world refuses to acknowledge exists. Eleanor Whitmore was not your typical small-town librarian. At 34, she held advanced degrees in both literature and anthropology from Harvard University. Yet she chose to work in the modest Blackwood Public Library in Western Massachusetts. Her colleagues described her as brilliant but eccentric, someone who preferred the company of books to people, and who had an almost supernatural ability to locate rare manuscripts and forgotten texts. The Blackwood Library itself was unusual. Built in 1892 on the site of a former psychiatric asylum, the building retained much of its original Victorian Gothic architecture. The basement level, where Eleanor spent most of her time cataloguing donations and acquisitions, still contained the original stone walls and iron fixtures from the asylum's storage areas. It was on a particularly cold February morning in 1947 when Eleanor made her discovery. A wealthy estate had donated several dozen boxes of books following the death of an elderly recluse named Bartholomew Crane. Crane had been a former professor of philosophy who had withdrawn from public life in the 1920s after what local records vaguely described as a nervous breakdown. Eleanor was working alone in the basement, methodically sorting through Crane's collection, when she noticed something peculiar. Buried beneath stacks of conventional philosophy texts and classical literature were 12 leather-bound volumes that appeared far newer than the rest. The leather was supple, the gold lettering pristine, and the pages crisp white rather than the yellowed brown she expected from books that should have been decades old. But it was the titles that first caught her attention. Each volume was labeled, simply with a name and dates: Margaret Susan Walsh, 1962 to 2011. David Michael Rodriguez, 1958 to 2023. Jennifer Ann Cooper, 1970 to 2041. Eleanor's first assumption was that these were perhaps genealogical records or family histories written in anticipation of future births. But when she opened the first volume, her blood ran cold. The book contained a complete biography of Margaret Susan Walsh, written as if she had already lived and died. It described her birth in Chicago to parents named Robert and Helen Walsh, her childhood during the 1970s, her marriage to a man named Thomas Bennett in 1985, the birth of her 3 children, her career as a high school mathematics teacher, and her death from pancreatic cancer at the age of 49. The detail was extraordinary. The book described specific conversations Margaret would have, the exact address of her childhood home, the names of her pets, her favorite songs, even the weather on the day she would die. Most disturbing of all, it described her growing awareness, beginning in her 30s, that her life was somehow being observed and documented by forces she couldn't understand. The book detailed her increasing paranoia, her desperate attempts to change her predicted path, and her ultimate realization that resistance was futile. Eleanor spent the next 3 days reading through all 12 volumes. Each contained the complete life story of a person who, according to the birth dates, wouldn't be born for at least another decade. The biographies were written with intimate knowledge, as if the author had personally witnessed every moment of these future lives. But these weren't pleasant stories of ordinary people living ordinary lives. Each biography was a catalogue of suffering, tragedy, and horror. David Michael Rodriguez would spend 30 years as a serial killer, claiming 47 victims before his capture in 2015. Jennifer Ann Cooper would survive a plane crash that killed her entire family, only to spend the rest of her life in psychiatric institutions, driven insane by survivors' guilt and visions of the dead. The most disturbing biography belonged to a child named Timothy James Morrison, born in 1960. According to the book, Timothy would grow up in an abusive household, develop severe psychological disorders, and eventually become convinced that he could communicate with otherworldly entities through acts of extreme violence. The biography described in graphic detail the ritualistic murders he would commit, the occult symbols he would carve into his victims, and his belief that he was preparing the world for some kind of cosmic transformation. Eleanor became obsessed with the books. She spent every waking moment reading and rereading the biographies, taking detailed notes, trying to understand how such knowledge could exist. She researched the names mentioned in the books, searching for any trace of the parents who would eventually give birth to these doomed individuals. Her research yielded disturbing results. In several cases, she found records of couples who matched the descriptions in the books exactly. Robert and Helen Walsh were real people living in Chicago, recently married, and, according to the biography, destined to conceive Margaret in late 1961. The accuracy was impossible to explain through coincidence. Eleanor began reaching out to these future parents, sending cryptic letters warning them about the children they would have. She never revealed the source of her knowledge, instead crafting her warnings to appear as the ravings of a disturbed individual. But her letters had an effect. Several couples moved away from their predicted locations. Others delayed having children or chose not to have children at all. This is where Eleanor's story takes a darker turn. As she continued her campaign to prevent the births predicted in the books, she began experiencing what she described in her journal as visitations. She wrote of seeing shadowy figures in the library after hours, of hearing whispers in languages she didn't recognize, of finding her carefully organized notes rearranged in patterns that resembled occult symbols. Eleanor's journal entries from this period reveal a woman slowly losing her grip on reality. She became convinced that the books were not predictions but instructions, that some malevolent force was using her to ensure that these tragic lives came to pass exactly as written. She believed that by warning the future parents, she was actually causing the very circumstances that would lead to their children's dark destinies. Her behavior at the library became increasingly erratic. Patrons reported that Eleanor would stare at them intensely, as if trying to see into their futures. She began refusing to help people find certain books, claiming that some knowledge was too dangerous to share. Her supervisor received complaints that Eleanor was approaching young women and asking disturbing questions about their plans for marriage and children. The breaking point came in December of 1947. Eleanor's final journal entry, dated December 20th, describes a revelation that filled her with absolute terror. She had discovered what she believed was her own biography among Crane's papers. Unlike the others, this book described her past and present with perfect accuracy, detailing her discovery of the future biographies and her subsequent descent into madness. But the most horrifying aspect of her own biography was its ending. According to the book, Eleanor Whitmore would disappear on December 21, 1947, after attempting to destroy the prophetic volumes. The book described how she would be found 3 days later in the basement of the library, her body positioned in the center of a complex geometric pattern drawn in her own blood, her eyes removed and placed on open pages of the future biographies. Eleanor's journal entry ends with a desperate plan to escape her predicted fate by destroying the books and fleeing Blackwood immediately, but she never got the chance. On the morning of December 21st, the library janitor found Eleanor's office in chaos. Books were scattered across the floor, furniture was overturned, and the 12 prophetic volumes were nowhere to be found. Eleanor herself had vanished without a trace. 3 days later, exactly as her biography had predicted, Eleanor's body was discovered in the basement. The scene matched the book's description perfectly. Local police ruled it a suicide, but several details were never made public. The geometric pattern drawn in Eleanor's blood contained symbols that scholars later identified as belonging to an obscure occult tradition practiced by certain asylum inmates in the late 19th century. Her missing eyes were found placed precisely on specific pages of books from Crane's collection, though not the prophetic volumes Eleanor had been seeking to destroy. The 12 future biographies were never recovered. Police searched Crane's entire collection but found no trace of the books Eleanor had described in her journal. Some investigators suggested that the books had never existed, that Eleanor had suffered a complete psychological breakdown and invented the entire story as a manifestation of her mental illness. But there were troubling inconsistencies with this explanation. Eleanor's letters to the future parents were real and documented. Several recipients came forward after her death, describing in detail the specific warnings she had given them about children they hadn't even conceived yet. More disturbing still, some of these couples reported experiencing strange occurrences after receiving Eleanor's letters: vivid nightmares about unborn children, unexplained feelings of dread about starting families, and in several cases, mysterious miscarriages that doctors couldn't explain. The investigation into Eleanor's death was quietly closed within 6 months, and the case files were sealed. The official explanation cited respect for the victim's family, but former police officers who worked on the case later claimed that pressure came from federal authorities who seemed unusually interested in the supernatural elements of the story. Bartholomew Crane's background remained largely mysterious. Records from his time as a philosophy professor revealed an academic interested in concepts of predetermination and free will. But colleagues described a gradual shift in his research toward more esoteric subjects in the years before his withdrawal from public life. His personal papers, found after his death, contained extensive notes on something he called temporal reconnaissance and references to experiments conducted at the asylum that had previously occupied the library's location. The asylum itself had a dark history that investigators largely ignored. Built in 1878, the Blackwood Psychiatric Institute had gained a reputation for experimental treatments that pushed the boundaries of medical ethics. Patient records from the 1880s and 90s described procedures designed to expand temporal perception and facilitate communication with future states of consciousness. The asylum was closed in 1891 after a scandal involving patient deaths, and most of its records were destroyed in a suspicious fire, just days before the official investigation was to begin. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Eleanor's story is what happened to the people named in those prophetic beginning in 1962, children matching the descriptions in Eleanor's notes began to be born. Margaret Susan Walsh was born in Chicago on the exact date predicted. To parents Robert and Helen Walsh, David Michael Rodriguez was born. In Los Angeles in 1958, 2 parents whose names and circumstances matched the biography perfectly. For years, nothing seemed unusual about these individuals. They grew up as normal children, attended school, formed relationships, pursued careers. But as they reached adulthood, disturbing patterns began to emerge. Margaret Walsh did indeed become a mathematics teacher, and she did marry a man named Thomas Bennett, but those close to her reported that she seemed increasingly troubled by vivid dreams about her future. Dreams that proved to be uncannily accurate. David Rodriguez's path was more dramatic. Friends from his teenage years later recalled that he had always been fascinated by violence and death, but it wasn't until his 20s that his behavior became truly disturbing. By 1985, he had committed his first murder, beginning a killing spree that would continue for exactly 30 years. Just as the biography had predicted, Jennifer Cooper's story followed the prophetic pattern as well. She survived a plane crash in 1995 that killed her husband and 2 children. The only survivor out of 147 passengers and crew, but her survival brought no peace. She spent her remaining years in and out of mental institutions, claiming that she could see and communicate with the dead passengers, that they visited her nightly to describe the pain of their deaths and the cold emptiness of their existence. Timothy Morrison's case was perhaps the most horrifying. Born in 1965 to an abusive family in rural Oregon, he displayed signs of severe psychological disturbance from early childhood. By his 20s, he had become obsessed with occult practices and claimed that shadowy entities were guiding his actions. Between 1990 and 2005, Morrison committed a series of ritualistic murders that shocked even experienced homicide investigators. His victims were found arranged in complex geometric patterns, their bodies mutilated in ways that seemed designed to create specific symbols rather than simply cause death. When Morrison was finally captured in 2005, he claimed that his murders were part of a larger plan, that he was preparing the world for what he called the convergence. Under interrogation, he described in detail his belief that certain individuals throughout history had been chosen to fulfill specific roles in a cosmic drama, and that resistance to these predetermined roles was not only futile but counterproductive. Most disturbing of all, Morrison possessed knowledge he shouldn't have had. He could describe the childhood homes and family histories of his victims with perfect accuracy, despite having no apparent means of obtaining such information. He knew details about their personal lives, their fears, their dreams, even their private conversations with family members. When asked how he acquired this knowledge, Morrison would only say that the books had told him everything he needed to know. The connection between Morrison's statements and Eleanor Whitmore's story was never officially acknowledged, but several investigators privately noted the similarities. Morrison's description of the books matched Eleanor's journal entries about the prophetic biographies. His references to predetermined roles and cosmic drama echoed themes from the future biographies Eleanor had described. But if these connections are real, they raise questions too terrifying to fully contemplate. Were the 12 individuals described in those mysterious volumes actually living out predetermined roles, following scripts written by unknown authors for unknowable purposes? Or were their tragic lives the result of some form of supernatural manipulation? Their fates sealed the moment Eleanor discovered their biographies. The most chilling possibility is that Eleanor's attempt to prevent these futures actually caused them to occur. Her letters to the future parents, meant as warnings, may have created the very circumstances that led to the births she was trying to prevent. Her research and documentation of the biographies may have somehow anchored these potential futures in reality, making them inevitable. This theory gains credence when we consider the strange circumstances surrounding the parents of the prophesied children. Several of the couples Eleanor contacted reported that her letters, rather than deterring them from having children, actually influenced their decisions to start families. Robert and Helen Walsh later stated that Eleanor's cryptic warning about their future daughter made them more determined than ever to have children, as if they were being compelled to fulfill a destiny they didn't understand. The geographic pattern of these births is also significant. Despite Eleanor's attempts to warn parents and encourage them to move away from their predicted locations, every child was born exactly where and when the biographies had foretold. In several cases, parents who had relocated to different states found themselves inexplicably drawn back to their original locations, just months before their children's predicted birth dates. Even more disturbing are the reports from the children themselves as they grew older. Margaret Walsh, David Rodriguez, Jennifer Cooper, and Timothy Morrison all described similar experiences during their teenage years. They reported dreams in which they saw their entire lives laid out before them like chapters in a book. Described a growing awareness that their choices and actions were not entirely their own, that they were following a path written by someone else. Several of them attempted to resist their predicted futures. Margaret Walsh tried to avoid becoming a teacher, instead pursuing a career in accounting. But a series of seemingly random events led her back to education. Her accounting firm closed unexpectedly. Teaching positions became available exactly when she needed work, and she found herself drawn to mathematics in ways she couldn't explain. Rodriguez made even more dramatic attempts to escape his destiny. After experiencing dreams about future murders, he voluntarily committed himself to psychiatric hospitals on multiple occasions. He moved to different states, changed his name, even attempted to have himself imprisoned for minor crimes in hopes of preventing the violence he saw in his dreams. But each attempt to alter his path only seemed to reinforce it. His psychiatric treatments introduced him to other patients who would later become his victims. His relocations brought him into contact with people who would play crucial roles in his killing spree. His attempts at self-imprisonment failed due to legal technicalities that he couldn't have predicted. The pattern suggests a level of predetermination that goes beyond simple prophecy. It's as if reality itself was being manipulated to ensure that these individuals followed their scripted paths, regardless of their personal desires or efforts to change course. This brings us to the most terrifying question of all. If 12 people's lives could be predetermined and documented in such detail, how many others might be living out similar scripts? Are there other collections of prophetic biographies hidden away in libraries, private collections, or government archives? Are some of us unwittingly following paths written by unknown authors for purposes we can't comprehend? The disappearance of Eleanor's prophetic volumes adds another layer of mystery to the story. Despite extensive searches by police and later by private investigators hired by several of the affected families, the 12 books have never been found. Some theorists suggest that the books were removed by the same forces that created them, their purpose fulfilled once the documented lives began to unfold. Others believe that the books still exist somewhere, possibly in the hands of individuals or organizations with an interest in predetermination and cosmic manipulation. There have been unconfirmed reports over the years of similar volumes surfacing in private collections, estate sales, and antiquarian bookshops. Each report describes books containing detailed biographies of people who haven't been born yet, written with the same impossible accuracy Eleanor discovered in 1940-7. Particularly intriguing report came from a retired librarian in Vermont who claimed to have found a single volume in a donation box in 2003. The book allegedly contained the biography of a child born in 1998, describing a life that would end in tragedy in 2031. The librarian, reportedly familiar with Eleanor's story, destroyed the book immediately, but not before photographing several pages. The photographs, if authentic, show text describing future events with the same level of impossible detail Eleanor had documented. Whether these reports are credible or simply urban legends inspired by Eleanor's story is impossible to determine, but they raise the disturbing possibility that the phenomenon she discovered was not unique, that there may be an entire system of predetermination operating beyond our awareness, documenting and perhaps directing human lives according to some incomprehensible agenda the academic community has largely dismissed. Eleanor's story as a case study in psychological breakdown and mass hysteria. The few scholars who have seriously investigated the case have found their careers damaged by association with what colleagues consider pseudoscientific nonsense. University libraries have removed Eleanor's journal and related documents from their collections, citing concerns about promoting harmful conspiracy theories. But the suppression of information about Eleanor's case may serve purposes beyond academic respectability. Government interest in the story, evidenced by the federal involvement in closing the investigation, suggests that some authorities take the implications seriously, enough to actively discourage research and discussion. This brings us to perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire story, the possibility that Eleanor's fate was itself predicted and documented somewhere. If the mysterious forces behind the prophetic biographies could accurately predict and script the lives of 12 ordinary individuals, what would prevent them from doing the same to someone who discovered their system? Eleanor's own biography, which she claimed to have found among the volumes, suggests that her discovery, investigation, and ultimate death were all part of a larger plan. The geometric pattern found drawn in Eleanor's blood at the crime scene contained symbols associated with temporal manipulation and consciousness transfer. According to occult researchers who have studied photographs of the scene, some theorists suggest that Eleanor's death was not simply murder or suicide, but a ritualistic process designed to bind her consciousness to the prophetic system, making her part of the mechanism that creates and enforces these predetermined lives. If this theory is correct, Eleanor may still exist in some form, trapped within the system she tried to destroy, forced to participate in documenting and directing future lives according to the agenda of her unknown captors. The thought that her brilliant mind, dedicated to knowledge and truth, might now be enslaved to serve forces of predetermination and control, is perhaps the most tragic element of her story. The 12 individuals whose lives were documented in Eleanor's prophetic volumes are all deceased now, their scripted existences complete. Margaret Walsh died of pancreatic cancer in 2011, exactly as predicted. David Rodriguez was captured and executed in 2023 after 30 years of murder. Jennifer Cooper took her own life in 2041, finally escaping the visions that had tormented her since surviving the plane crash. Timothy Morrison died in prison in 2027, claiming until the end that his work preparing the world for the convergence was unfinished. Their deaths might seem to represent the end of this dark chapter, but evidence suggests otherwise. New reports continue to surface of individuals experiencing dreams and visions similar to those described by the 12 victims. People from various backgrounds and locations describe seeing their entire lives played out in vivid detail while they sleep, watching themselves make choices and face consequences that feel predetermined rather than freely chosen. Some of these individuals have attempted to document their experiences, creating what they call reverse biographies, detailed accounts of futures they claim to have seen in their dreams. The accuracy of these self-prophesies varies, but in several documented cases, people have successfully predicted major life events, career changes, relationships, and even deaths with unsettling precision. The pattern suggests that whatever system created the prophetic biographies Eleanor discovered may still be active, continuing to document and direct human lives according to its incomprehensible agenda. The 12 victims may have been merely the first wave in a larger plan, test subjects whose scripted lives were used to refine and perfect the process of predetermination. Eleanor Whitmore's story serves as a warning about the dangers of seeking forbidden knowledge and the terrible price of discovering truths that humanity was never meant to know. Her fate reminds us that some mysteries exist not to be solved, but to be avoided. Some books are meant to remain closed, some knowledge is too dangerous to possess, and some futures are too dark to contemplate. But perhaps most importantly, story forces us to confront the possibility that our lives may not be as free and self-determined as we believe. In a universe where future biographies can be written with perfect accuracy decades before their subjects are born, where individual choices and resistance seem powerless against predetermined fates, what hope do any of us have for genuine autonomy? The answer may lie in Eleanor's own example. Despite knowing her predicted fate, despite seeing her own death described in impossible detail, she chose to fight against the forces of predetermination until her final moment. Her resistance may have been futile, but it was also authentically human, a refusal to accept that our lives are nothing more than scripts, written by unknown authors for unknowable purposes. Whether Eleanor's courage in facing the impossible represents true free will or simply another scripted element in a predetermined story, we may never know. But her legacy challenges each of us to question the nature of our own choices, to examine the paths we follow, and to resist any force, natural or supernatural, that would reduce human life to mere performance of predetermined roles. In the end, Eleanor Whitmore's story is not just about prophetic books or cosmic manipulation, it's about the eternal human struggle between fate and freedom, between predetermined destiny and conscious choice. It's about the price of knowledge and the courage required to confront truths that challenge our most fundamental assumptions about reality. And somewhere, in a basement library, in a small Massachusetts town, the shadows still gather where Eleanor made her terrible discovery, waiting for the next curious soul who might stumble upon knowledge too dangerous to possess, too important to ignore.